Good evening. It's August 9th, 2013. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I would like to welcome you to our weekly broadcast from LaRouchePAC.com, a webcast featuring Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. Tonight I am being joined by Leandra Bernstein in the studio. We have a question which has come in, which has also been published on the LaRouche PAC website, and I would like to ask Leandra Bernstein to come to the podium to read this question.
All right, thank you. Now, this statement has been drafted by Jeff Steinberg, and it concerns a Glass-Steagall fight, and it's titled Wall Street Mafia in Desperate Drive to Stop Glass-Steagall. The criminal enterprise known as the Wall Street Too Big to Fail Banks is engaged in a desperate effort to block passage of Glass-Steagall. Bills have been introduced in both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate to reinstate the 1933 legislation that broke up the banks into totally separate commercial and investment entities. Through a lobbying effort estimated to have cost more than $300 million, Wall Street was able to repeal Glass-Steagall in 1999. So far, 25 state legislatures have introduced or passed resolutions demanding that their congressional delegations support Glass-Steagall's passage. And major labor, farm, and civil rights organizations have also fully endorsed the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall separation. In response to that nationwide outpouring of support for Glass-Steagall, Wall Street has responded with a four-pronged assault to block passage, according to well-placed Washington sources. These reports grid precisely with evidence directly obtained by LaRouche PAC organizers. First, the Big Six Wall Street banks, J.P. Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and Wells Fargo have unleashed their lobbyists and trade associations to target state legislators backing the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall. Evidence of this operation has already surfaced in Delaware, Minnesota, South Dakota, and in California. Second, members of the U.S. House and Senate have been personally contacted by top officials of the Big Six banks and threatened with loss of campaign support and with loss of thousands of jobs in their districts unless they drop their support for the Glass-Steagall bills. Third, the CEOs and other top executives of too big to fail banks have been placing personal calls to congressional leaders and other pro-Glass-Steagall influential figures, further threatening reprisals against any people who persist in pressing for Glass-Steagall. Fourth, LaRouche PAC activists mobilizing support for Glass-Steagall have been targeted for physical attacks, vandalism, police harassment, and other active measures to blunt the growing support for breaking up the banks and throwing the top Wall Street criminals in jail. These attacks have been organized on a local-by-local basis, using whatever hooligan elements can be hired to carry out those attacks. According to one informed Washington source, Wall Street and the Obama White House were caught completely off guard by the rapid escalation of support for Glass-Steagall. The movement toward passage of the reinstatement bills moved ahead far more rapidly than anyone in the administration or the Big Six banks had expected. The fact that half of the state legislatures in the country, including New York and California, introduced resolutions calling for the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall indicated a level of mass public support that posed an existential threat to the very survival of the too-big-to-fail criminal enterprises of Wall Street. It should be no surprise that the too-big-to-fail banks have resorted to mafia tactics to push back against the momentum for Glass-Steagall. The banks are being protected from long overdue criminal prosecution by the Obama White House and the Justice Department, which has officially adopted the Holder Doctrine, under which the big banks, particularly their top executives, have been given a literal license to steal and murder with immunity from prosecution. with Detroit showcasing the outright genocidal consequences of such policies as a rating of the LIBOR interest rates and the manipulation of interest rate swaps to loot the already desperate city budgets, the ability of the Obama administration to continue their protection racket is running up against a growing popular rage. The desperate Wall Street actions targeting Glass-Steagall are criminal in their own right. Given these facts, would you please make your opening remarks?
Well, the significance of this is the fact that the relevant people have been caught right-handed, left-handed, and backhanded. And they are now, in the sense of a subject to a thorough investigation before and after this proceeding is completed. In other words, they're not going to get away with this on their own basis, because they're still subject to what they've done in fraud in this case. This means hope for the United States, because the acts that have taken and the fact that they are traced to these agencies, not just these banks, but political institutions which are responsible for this sort of stuff. And therefore, that means that unless Glass-Steagall is automatically victorious in this matter, then the question is how much fraud was perpetrated in order to bring about a defeat of Glass-Steagall. So the issue is not settled. It can be settled by a victory of Glass-Steagall, but it cannot otherwise. The fact that this thing, what are charges that are made in terms of reporting facts, and they are reported facts, that means that you've got something very dirty going on, and it can lead to very serious consequences for members of the Congress. Because in some cases this was done, or was being done, under the instigation of members of the Congress and their agents. So it's a very hot situation. The other side of the thing is the positive side, is the fact that these guys were caught without, caught out. They had no anticipation of such an event as occurring in that form. Indicates the importance and the probable victory, which probably lies, an honest victory, lies in the hands of those who are defending the Glass-Steagall reenactment. And therefore anything that's done which gets even close to that kind of problem, where there's a doubt about who actually got the vote, and whether intimidation was used, which is really a felony. If intimidation was used to effect a defeat of the Glass-Steagall motion, then that's another issue. So we are not going to obviously sit back and watch this process. We will watch it, but we are also going to look into the hooliganism which is being already in progress to try to defeat Glass-Steagall. The attempt to change the definition of what the law is in itself monstrous. And particularly when you consider the fact that what the intention is on the other legislation. If Glass-Steagall is not victorious, and if something like that is proposed is introduced instead, you're going to see something else which is really darker. The Queen of England, who is actually the controller of this process, including responsibility for participation in this fraud, has declared her intention that she is going to reduce the population of the planet through her powers and the empire she controls, to reduce the population of the planet from 7 billion people to 1 or less. She is presently headed toward less. which would mean the greatest mass murder that the planet has ever known. Imagine going from 7 billion people down to less than 1 billion people. Well, what's the population of China? Population of China is what? How many billion people? 1.4 probably, something like that. What about Russia? What about India? What about Japan? You mean you're going to wipe out, one way or the other, you're going to wipe out most of the population of China. You're going to wipe out most of the population of Japan, of India, of Russia, and other countries. This is what is at stake here. Because the Queen of England, who is actually the backer of these policies, the one who's instrumental, and she's declared herself to be in that. She's declared herself as intending to bring about a reduction of the human population from 7 billion people to less than 1. She's done it. She intends it. And she has the power to do so. It's not England. It's not the British Isles. She controls much more. She controls more or less directly about 40% of the human population and has a great influence on others, great pressure. So you want to see, in a quick run, you want to see the population of this planet falling from below the 7 billion people it was at least recently to the less than 1 billion people, which is indicated now. What this would be largely starvation, be the key thing. You see starvation now. There is not enough food being produced in the United States to meet the requirements of the population of the United States. And that's what she has done. The green policy is one of the means by which the genocide will be effected. People have been fooled into this idea of green policy. But what that green policy has meant so far is there's not enough food to feed the population of the nation. And that is not something that's a natural occurrence. That's something that was done deliberately, intentionally under her direction. And she takes responsibility for it. She says she is the one, and with her cohorts, she is the one who's pressing the genocide. She's the one who's demanding the genocide. And the other side, look in U.S. history. You take from not so deep into the United States history, that there has been a control over the banking system and related institutions of the United States has been from Britain. And this has been, these things have been her policy now, but this goes back to then. It goes back to the early part of our nation. And it's evil. It has been evil all along. It was only after we won the Civil War that we were able to put some checks on genocide, which was already going on. And then afterward, we've had the same kind of problem before, with presidents who are controlled by banks which are located usually around, they're British banks, controlled around New York area and Boston. And this was the concentration of banking which was used to do all the dirties against the United States up to that time. And that's where we are. So we have the two things. First of all, this is a criminal operation, but in terms of what the facts are that are presented. If you're hiring gangsters to go out and try to change the policy of the United States by gangster methods, that's a crime. And that's what they've declared themselves intending to do. On the other hand, the policies that the Queen is pushing, which is their policy, the same institutions that involved in this are the ones who intend to do this, put this thing through. So you're facing your genocide, your victimization and genocide is what you're facing. And these guys, these hooligans who are using these kinds of methods already, hooligan methods, means that these guys are criminals. And if we don't beat these guys and hold them now, you're going to see a lot fewer citizens of the United States in other countries surviving.
And I would just emphasize that the release that Leandra read is posted on the LaRouche PAC website and is available everywhere and must go into mass circulation very quickly. The next question comes in from some institutional contacts inside Washington. The question is, Mr. LaRouche, as you are aware, President Obama has canceled the planned summit meeting next month with the president of Russia, Putin, citing the Edward Snowden affair, among other issues, as the reason. How can the United States improve relations with Russia? Despite the Snowden affair, the 2+2 meetings between Secretary of State Kerry, Secretary of Defense Hagel, and other Russian counterparts is taking place and could play a positive role in reducing misunderstanding on volatile policy issues such as Syria. How would you recommend the United States and Russia proceed? Can the Geneva II plan be revived? And in the larger framework, how would you redefine the U.S.-Russian relationship?
Well, there's not much Russia could do about this problem because Russia has not actually done anything which is really legitimately considered an offense against the United States. They've done nothing. They've done everything to avoid that. Now, the Snowden affair is not an issue because Russia has a policy, a standing policy. They are not liable to force this guy to go back to the United States. And the general opinion is that the intention would be to, beat him up, kill him pretty fast. A nasty accident to happen. They don't want him around. Now, on the other side of this thing, you have to realize that the current president of the United States is walking closer and closer to impeachment. We had one impeachment of that type back in the early 1970s. And I think we might have the repetition of that now. But he's not going to remain in, likely, unless some very extraordinary things are done. He is not popular. He has committed offenses. The programs which have been run under his administration are objectionable to the American people in the great majority. The only thing that enables him to stay in office is intimidation of the citizens. Now, this guy is out. He's about to go. And what's been done, as it already revealed in revelations that have been made, that what has been done have been criminal activity in point of fact. Treasonous and also treasonous. To intimidate, and by the methods that are reported so far. And the Snowden affair, Snowden is accused of what? Snowden is accused of objecting to those methods, those frauds. He's saying that the whole thing is a fraud, that the people of the United States are led helpless, that the government of the United States so far has been impotent because of these policies, and that's the only thing that's kept him in office, is corruption. And this guy's corruption is already far worse than Nixon's. Nixon was a small-time fish compared to what this guy has done and what his people have done to him. So this guy should be thrown out of office. The American people deserve to have the right to have this guy thrown out of office because he's committing crimes. And what we're getting flowing through day after day after day. And one of the curious thing that infuriates Obama in particular, but especially London more than Obama, is the fact that it's true. The charges against his administration are true. And that's it. So this thing has to be dispensed with. This president does more than fully deserve to be thrown out of office. they've got the votes yet to ensure he's being thrown out of office is irrelevant. This guy, for what he's done, what his administration has done, what the facts that have been put on the floor on this same issue, no, this guy has no right to be in the presidency of the United States. So if the president of the United States, so-called, or whatever that is, complains, so what? All he's doing is compounding his crimes by trying to complicate the relationship with Russia when Russia has done nothing that the United States should object to. It was no violation of law. The United Nations organization leaned in that direction of supporting that. So what's the problem? Obama should save a lot of expenses by just resigning and walking out of office. That's the best thing he could do. And the fact that and Russia should be praised for that. They didn't violate the law. They didn't violate their own law. They took no extraordinary measures to embarrass the United States. The President of the United States is the great embarrassment of the United States, not him.
Now, we have a question that has come in from Bill Roberts, who, as people know, is a member of the Policy Committee and is a former candidate for Congress in the Michigan 11th District. And this is in the context of a release that just was published on the LaRouche PAC website, which is a report titled Detroit Arsenal of Democracy or Test Case for Fascism, which has as its cover letter a statement that Bill Roberts wrote called Bankrupt Wall Street, Not Detroit. So this is available on the LaRouche PAC site. Now, Bill's question is as follows. He says, as much as Wall Street and their media outlets would like people to believe that Detroit's problems are a unique case of chronic mismanagement, anyone who's not stupid realizes that there is a strategy to try to isolate Detroit and pick off others one by one. Yesterday, the school district of Inkster, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit, was dissolved under a new emergency type of state law, and the students of Inkster will have to attend the 4 surrounding school districts that are still in place. Out of those 4 school districts, 2 of them have been running their own budget deficits and could be dissolved too. One of the difficulties the Inkster School District has faced over the last 10 years is that they have absorbed many of the students from Detroit schools that have been shut down. Right now, the school board of Pontiac, Michigan, is fighting to keep employees paid and to keep their doors open. The school board president said, "We are technically fighting for our lives." Also, 3 local governments in Michigan, Saginaw County, the city of Battle Creek, and Genesee County, have all had to withdraw millions of dollars in offered bonds off of the market in the last 2 weeks due to the lack of willingness of purchasers to invest in their municipal bonds. In the case of Genesee County, it is unclear how this inability to raise $54 million will affect plans to build new water and sewer infrastructure. This is being referred to as the Detroit penalty. Clearly, Detroit is not alone, for better or for worse. Many of the labor union and other leaders that I have talked to in the last several days have responded strongly to the strategy of flipping this Detroit situation on its head, recognizing that Wall Street is the vulnerable one and that it is time to go on the offensive for a national top-down solution that bankrupts Wall Street and sets up a credit system for national development. They also agree, strictly as a matter of taste, that Jamie Dimon would look excellent in an orange jumpsuit and silver bracelets. What would you say to these local leaders as advice on a strategy for victory?
This is a little more complicated in detail than that might suggest. What happened is I was involved in this. I became a voluntary promoter and leader of an effort to save the automobile industry in the United States. We had quite a good fight for a while, and some of the people then, under great pressure, caved in on the promise that they, who were then retiring senior employees, engineering design people, that they would get their full pension. And therefore, that pressure coming from outside convinced them to give up the fight. And I was left staring barefaced, I guess I was always bare, and out there under those circumstances. Now, what the result of this was, and what I was involved in was an estimate of how we could deal with this whole problem, the threat of shutting out the auto industry and what it represents. Now, the automobile industry was the make anything and everything industry, really. It was called the auto industry, but you have to remember that the acme of the auto industry was that it was extended to become the everything industry under conditions of warfare. We would have lost World War II but for the auto industry, because it was mobilized. They were thinking of shutting it down already, large parts shutting it down. But they decided instead, under Roosevelt, to go ahead with a full mobilization, and we produced everything. Now, what I was in the middle of, when I was in this fight to save the auto industry, was that we had territories all over the United States which have been manufacturing, and manufacture anything territories. You want to make airplanes? Whatever you want, we could make it. Because it was based on the idea of the machine tool design operation. Everything was based on machine tool design. And if you had to make a new design, you would make it. Why? Because you had the tool makers and so forth who were capable of producing this result. Now, when the auto industry in the United States collapsed, as it was collapsed, we ceased to be a real nation. We lost the core of our ability to have a working economy. And with other policies, and as in the area of grains and food supplies and so forth, the American people are being starved to death. The food supply is not sufficient to maintain the people of the United States as a result of this kind of thing. The conditions in Michigan, throughout northern Ohio, going into Chicago even, New York State, all of these areas are areas which I knew, in each of these territories, the greatest potential of machine tool design on this planet. Now, it wasn't fully being used, but the plants were there, the engineering skills were there, and it's the engineering skills of the driver of everything, the auto industry, aircraft industry, whatever you want. And it's the auxiliaries of this process, of the auto industry, which made up for the rest of it. So what happened was that under the Bush administration, where this tragedy happened, the United States was turned into a rubbish pile. Now, we are not a rubbish pile. We are people. We still have aging people who are machine tool design people. It's the top of the skills business. A few of them are still left, but there's a shrunken amount. So the United States is no longer an economic power because of this. Now, where do jobs go? The jobs went to China, to Korea, Japan, other places, especially China, so forth. Does that mean we have to get the automobile business back to Russia, China? No, we don't. Because machine tool design is a very peculiar kind of thing. And we in the United States still have people who are not at work that much anymore in that direction. But we have these skills. Now we have in the United States, we have the immediate potential of opening up entire categories of new industries. It would start in a small way because you put a leader cadre group in. But we have projects, for example, right now we don't have any food production to speak of in the central states of the United States. Tennessee is no longer something to be proud of. It's been destroyed, essentially. California, which is one of the bounty area for production of foodstuffs and everything else, is now dying. It's impoverished, wrecked, dying. All these things have been done, especially since Bill Clinton left office. And then, of course, and the Bush family. The Bush families in government has been a key instrument in causing all of this trouble, including Prescott Bush, the guy who backed Adolf Hitler. Not a good guy, and that family has not got a good reputation when you look at the record. But the point is, we don't need to get the jobs back from China into the United States. What we need to do is simply do what Glass-Steagall will permit us to do. If we enact Glass-Steagall in this election, as of January of this coming year, we will have a turnabout of two types, two aspects, a turnabout in the entire history of the United States since the Bushes got in control of the place. We will go back. We have a limited number of people who are aging, admittedly, in terms of these high-skilled jobs. But we have enough to open up both training schools for design engineers and using a core of senior people now, who are senior skilled people, to get into motion to producing what? Restore the water system of the central states of the United States, along the Mississippi and Missouri. That has to be done, or we cannot feed our people even with the present population. California used to be a bonanza state. That's been destroyed. We can rebuild it because the ground is there. What they need largely is water. Water and things that go with water. Now, California is a natural place. They've done a good job with water before, and they can do it again. We can rebuild the Mississippi, Missouri water system. We can do a number of other things of that type. We can rebuild some industries. We can save Texas. Texas is now dying. It's killing its own cattle, and it's dying as a part of the economy. What we need to do is go to the higher level of technologies, to design and engineering. We need nuclear power. With nuclear power, back to nuclear power, real nuclear power, we can get a driver going on short notice. We can only, with that method, we can bring a rapid recovery in terms of mobilizing the water resources which are necessary to prevent the western states of the United States from dying. So therefore, this is what the auto industry meant. Therefore, the people in that area which were affected by the auto industry, from New York State, along the coast of the Great Lakes and so forth, into Missouri, this development we can get back again, because we still have people living in those areas who have these skills. They may be aged, relatively speaking, for what they were 10 years ago, but they have these skills. They have the mind, they have the brains, they can train and educate people. We will go to the highest level of technology the world has ever seen, and we can do it within 10 years. We're going to have to fight our way up. But that's what this means. That's what this issue of Detroit is. Detroit is a central reference point for a whole area of the United States, or areas as well, in which this kind of skill existed. It still exists, much of it unemployed. but they can teach as well as do. And we need a generation of new trainees in this business. With that, we can rebuild our nation. We don't have to go back and get the Chinese to give back China how to produce automobiles.
Well, this next question will be an excellent follow-up to what you've just stated. This is a question from Ben Deniston, one of the leaders of our scientific research team. And it's on the subject of what you just discussed. The necessary solution is to retool that make-anything industry, as you stated, but from the standpoint of leaping ahead and leaping into the future to an entirely new technology. So what Ben asks is the following. He says, Mr. LaRouche, you have recently been discussing a thermonuclear NWAPA, which has provoked a number of people to ask, what would a thermonuclear NWAPA look like? And how will Detroit play into this perspective? He says, in the basement, we have done some preliminary work examining the vast improvements provided by advanced nuclear fission systems. The original NWAPA design was grand for its time, but it depended upon hydropower, which meant that excess fresh water would have to be collected, stored, and moved by the system only to then be released down the Pacific coast and into the ocean, just to generate the electrical power needed to pump the rest of the water east and into the southwest. In terms of the ratio of water collected, the water used for power generation versus the water distributed for productive use, this original NWAPA design would have about a 40% loss factor, give or take. Making the entire system nuclear-powered, however, upgrades the project to an entirely new level. And when we include additional options for nuclear desalination, we are creating the ability to double the amount of fresh water that NWAPA can deliver, at least. I think that this is an incredibly important and clear demonstration of the relationship between, on the one side, the energy flux density employed per square kilometer of a territory, and on the other, the resulting increased physical ability of mankind to improve the productivity of that territory. With the nuclear NWAPA, this interrelationship between energy density and the productive utilization of water for the entire continent, taken as a unit, is very clear. Nuclear power allows for us to create a denser spinning of the water, using and reusing the water by plant life more times per cycle. And I don't think that there is any hope for American agriculture and food security without this project. So he asks, can you elaborate on your concept of a thermonuclear NWAPA? He says, when I include your recent references to the need for international technology sharing as well, what comes to my mind is a call for an international Manhattan Project. The historical precedent of the interrelationship between Franklin Roosevelt's development projects such as the TVA and the success of the Manhattan Project come to mind, where the energy density in the Tennessee Valley laid the basis for Oak Ridge to be able to successfully conduct the atomic fission research projects in that location. He says, to me, it seems clear that creating the potential for the development of a full-scale fusion economy is as much a part of NWAPA as is the water itself. But I would like to see if that is how you are thinking about it. This perspective, the role of NWAPA in the actual creation of a new future state for our nation, makes the full implications of the Detroit case clear. Detroit can actually play a critical role in giving the American people this future. Wall Street can deliver nothing but death and destruction. If we let Wall Street succeed in fully destroying Detroit, It is not just Detroit that we are losing, but the very future itself. Is this the perspective that you see when you are calling for a thermonuclear NWAPA?
Let's go back a bit earlier. That description sort of, for most of us, speaks for itself. But let's look at what the background is. Let's talk about the stupidity of much of our school systems and other things on the question of science. Now, people don't understand the difference between man and an ape, actually. And that's a very important thing to consider here. Because man is not an ape. Not even a big, clever chimpanzee or a gorilla, nice old fat gorilla, you know. Well, you should read about the gorillas while they were still alive, and so forth. They are quite different than usually described. But what is the difference between man and an animal? There's a fundamental difference. And it should seem to us that since we are not just animals, but human beings, that maybe we ought to have policies that fit the capacities of human beings rather than animals. Animals are limited to the kind of species they're born into. Human beings not. The human being is different from the animal. The human being is the only known species of life which is capable of increasing its power voluntarily in mankind. And this is not just physical power, this is increase in creativity. For example, the difference between man and the ape is a very simple one. We discovered a long time ago that there were certain places where ape-like people, or pulp-like people, would have firesides. In other words, they had all the charcoal and the meal and so forth. The evidence of there would be a archaeologist dig these things out, particularly in South Africa. Okay? Now, we've gone from that level of man as a fire bringer to higher orders of magnitude of fire. And thermonuclear fusion is one of those higher forms. We went from things which, from wood, burning wood, using charcoal is a higher form of wood. We're going to higher degrees of chemistry in terms of power. So man is a fire bringer. And many kinds of fire, all the way through thermonuclear fusion and matter-antimatter reactions, and beyond. So mankind's mind, through scientific progress, through increase of the energy flux density per capita per person, is what makes the difference between man and an ape, or a mere monkey. So therefore, the question is, how do you define man? Well, you have to educate man in each level of this process. They have to be re-educated to a higher level. Now, this means that the energy flux density per capita has to be increased. It means the concentration of everything is increased in terms of fire and energy flux density. Without that method, the human species could not have existed as human. And anyone who's doing what the green policy demands is actually turning man back into a dead ape, because mankind could not live under those conditions today. And it would go down from ape down to something much more primitive. And that's what the Queen of England wishes. And this whole issue we're dealing with comes from the Queen of England and her associates. And the Queen of England is not the head of a state called Great Britain. She herself said during the Copenhagen period, she herself emphasized that she is an empire which controls over 40% of the planet in her own influence and right. She has decreed that we are to reduce the human population from 7 billion people to less than 1. She has publicly said so. That's her policy. That is what is happening. That's what's happening to our food policy. We have turned food into chemical substances. We've taken the food away and made it something that's not humans can't use. We have done that and caused starvation and accelerated death rates among human beings in the United States by that green policy. The green policy is a mass murderous policy. The energy flux density of the green movement, and that's when you use a method of growth of production, and you go from higher level to green. If you go to green, you're going to starve. You're going to die. Because the green policies always have a lower energy flux density concentration than the higher ones. If you go to green, you're going to increase the death rate throughout the planet. And now as the relics of the old system, which was good, dry out, you're going to find out that the carrying capacity, as they call it, for the planet, for human beings, was going to drop not just once, it's going to drop all the way down back to primitive times. Mankind, if he's lucky, is going to be an ape. So therefore, what the issue here is we don't need energy flux density, higher energy flux density. We now on the edge, we do have to thermonuclear fusion. We are on the verge where we should be bringing that in more and more directly into our production. That will increase our productivity, increase the ability of people to survive. And you won't murder people. If you go with the green policy is guaranteed to cause an accelerating death rate among the people of the world. It's mass murder. It's a crime against humanity. Now, why would the Queen want to reduce with her power over the nations of the world? And it is a great power. She's only one. The Dutch are the same thing, the Dutch kingdom. As a matter of fact, the British Empire was created by a Dutch invasion of the British Isles. So this is really bad Dutch stuff. But anyway, so therefore we have to do this progress. We have to. Otherwise, we're not acting like human beings. We're acting like beasts. And to do that is simple. Ben is referring to concentration of water. How we can concentrate that, and he eliminates a lot of silly things that people believe about water. About that, they think it's not like gasoline. You don't consume it like gasoline. You just recycle it, and it does something for you by your recycling it, and it remains there. It's still there, unless you decide to destroy it. But so that's what this means. It means that we have to have a program now to drive productivity to higher levels, to increase what we call the energy flux density of everything. Concentration in terms of water, concentration in terms of all kinds of materials. And every time you go to a higher level of energy flux density, you find out it costs you less in real terms to exist. In other words, progress comes automatically with the proper application of increase of energy flux density. Now, we have a lot of poor jerks out there who don't know anything about this. They've been miseducated. Schools have miseducated them in the United States, in Europe, and so forth. You have a whole green movement, and the whole thing is nuts. Because every time you go to green, you are going not down one bounce down. You are going through a self-feeding process of decay of the whole human species. If you try to do that, if you try to green policy, you are going to exterminate a great part of the human race. And that's what the Queen's talking about. She's saying that we can control the population by keeping them stupid. And the green policy's characteristic is it suggests having stupid people, that you can do better with stupid people than intelligent ones. And that's what this is all about. So therefore, this is not some future thing which is doubtful. This is the way that mankind has always proceeded when it was successful. And when mankind did not do that, mankind went backwards. and became fewer and died more younger and died more frequently. It's inhuman. It's inhuman. And what Wall Street is doing is mass murder. It's inhuman. It's one of the greatest crimes ever committed against the human race. And those people are criminals because what they're doing is criminal. And since what they're doing is criminal, they must be criminals too. Otherwise, they couldn't be criminals or something.
Okay, well, I'd like to ask the final question of the evening, and this is on the issue of agriculture. The question comes in from Bob Baker, who is a leading field organizer with LaRouche PAC for a number of years. He also has a history in farming and has continued his work within the farming community with farmers and agriculturalists. And he says, in thinking about the current food production of United States agriculture, the so-called family farm has been restructured with breathtaking speed into a relatively small number of mega-production operations. We have a relatively very few food-producing operations producing our food. For instance, a February 2013 U.S. Department of Agriculture report stated that the U.S. in 2012 had 2.2 million farms. 10% of these farms produced 82% of the value of total U.S. agricultural production. On 59% of these farms, the on-farm share of household income was negative 9%. Overall, for the total 2.2 million U.S. farms, 83% of total household income was off-farm income. Now, about 1/2 of U.S. farm income comes from livestock, from cattle, hogs, dairy, poultry, and sheep. So he breaks down the figures. For beef cows, 10% produce 55% of the beef. For dairy cows, 12% produce 75% of the milk. For hogs, 13% produce 88% of the pork. For sheep, 6.1% produce 65% of the mutton. So, as we can see, U.S. food production has been consolidated into the hands of very few but very large operations. Now, he goes on to discuss the technology level of U.S. agriculture is very high. He says tractors, combines, and the tillage implements have been equipped and connected to the computer age, and the GPS and soil fertility technology is the highest and the most beautiful. The farm operator of today loves to produce and use all the latest technology. So his question is twofold. What should we use to measure the size of the modern scientific high-tech family farm into the future? What is the significance of the idea of a family farm in the overall structure of the economy into the future? And what metric do we use as a guideline for the proper size of a modern high-tech family farm? Second, how does the return of the Glass-Steagall Act and parity pricing impact the structure of U.S. farming? Even many farmers would complain that with much higher parity prices, the big farmers will just get that much bigger faster due to the increased income. They would worry about the price of land going higher and higher with corn and soybeans at a parity price because it could be twice as high as the current prices, which are the highest levels in history. So if you could address those questions.
Yes, well, let me take one example because this is a complex thing. Let's take one example which gives you a measure of what we're talking about. Now, let's take the Central Plains area from the Mississippi and Missouri and so forth and westward, the part that's agricultural. What has happened to our water supply in that region? The water supply has fallen so low that we're going to have to shut down farming. So therefore, if you're using up, if your agriculture is based on water, and you don't have enough water to grow crops, what's your productivity? The other thing is, also, if you use methods which are mass methods, which may be for a short period of time, a short interval of time, which may seem adequate, what you're really doing, what is demonstrated on the water basis alone, the fact that we have not maintained the water levels for farming in that whole region is dying. And we're now killing off the crops, the cattle and so forth, which are involved in the same area. So therefore, when you take that view of the matter, how's your policy doing? Yes, this farmer may be rich. He may be gobbling up his neighbors because they didn't have enough to compete with him. But what happened to the water supply? Yes, in some parts of the northern parts of the Canadian edge, you have some ability in North Dakota and so forth, in those areas with high water areas. But on the main area of the whole western plains, the whole prairie plains, the whole thing is dying, is killed by the policy, the very policy which many people say is good. It says it's made some of us rich, and the number of us rich people is getting fewer and fewer. In the meantime, you cannot get the water level up which is acceptable for growing crops in these areas. And this has just reached a crucial point recently. So the obvious thing we have to do is, the first thing we have to do, if we're going to save agriculture, which is on the verge of dying, we have to deal with the water problem. Now, this is what Ben was involved in dealing with, in the water problem, water management. The first thing we have to do is we have to get a form of NWAPA which gives us enough leverage on water, which the old NWAPA system couldn't give, which is what he's referring to. So we need a system of sufficient gain factor in water supply to the Central Plains and California and so forth. We need that. Otherwise, we're not going to have agriculture this way. And people will be dying off. And maybe the water will sort of leak back, but not. Because actually when man is cultivating, as we know from our experience in the United States in general, we actually were working, as we did, to increase the productivity of production per square unit, not by looting. And it was the more intensive concentration, not this large scale of producing 50 million of everything, but the cultural process of complex farming, and the extended family farm is the best model for that, for most cases, because you're getting the most efficient utilization in terms of productivity, in terms of land. And what we can do is we can improve the productivity of the so-called family farm, upgrade it by giving it the better power to function with. And that should be our process. We just first simply recognize that what the stories are that are told, the tales that are told, are bunk. Because if you look and say, well, what about water? What about water? How's the water situation? That exposes the whole fraud of Monsanto.
Well, with that as the final word, that brings a conclusion to our broadcast for tonight. So thank you, Lynn. Thank you very much, Leandra. And thank you, Ben, and everybody else who participated. Stay tuned, and we will see you again. Good night.